Rachel Sklar is the founding editor at Mediaeye and Huffington Post, where she launched Eat the Press. And she's also a self-described media addict on the loose. And we've captured her this afternoon, so we're very excited about that. You've likely read her work on New York Times, Newsweek, The Daily Beast, or seen her on TV talking about the media. And Rachel, you are a driving force in this new changing social media culture. And today, you're going to tell us about the blind spots, right?
I am.
You can even use
too late.
Even better.
I'm up.
And she has cute shoes, too. So.
Very important. It bears highly on my content. Thank you.
So, Rachel, the future of journalism is?
All right. Hi. Thank you very much for having me. I just got here because I had a very late flight last night, so I apologize. But I'm going to talk to you today about basically what you're missing. What we miss when we are looking somewhere else. All right. Where do I direct this? There. All right. The blind spot. That is where we're going to miss things. So moving on. So I started an organization called Change the Ratio. I co-founded it with a friend of mine, Emily Gannett, to address basically the manifestation of the blind spot, which is the lack of recognition, awareness, mentioning, funding, you name it, for women. And it's not just for women in tech, although that is the concentration right now. It's for women across the board. One thing that I've noticed from being in many different industries and from being in the media industry and from monitoring all this stuff is that across different industries, you see the same ratio problem, wherein that there's the reality and then there's the ratio, and somewhere in between is the blind spot where women are being invisibilized and not recognized. So we're going to start with media, though. This is a study from Vita.com about bylines in thought leadership magazines. And if you can't read, I'm sure you can guess which one represents men and which one represents women. Even Slate, ultra contrarian, acknowledged that they were surprised by the disparity of that ratio. And I should note that it's not just the quantitative, but it's also the qualitative. Typically, women tend to be sort of gently directed, let's just say that, towards more womany content. David Remnick was called on it, and he's not. The New Yorker is obviously not the only place where the byline disparity needs to be addressed, but he basically said, we need to do better. And Katha Pollitt noted that if you really want more women writers, then you get more women editors. And what that means is that, again, people with a more diverse perspective are able to see beyond, let's say, looking in a very narrow window. So I'm going to use the example of Anne Friedman, who runs the Lady Journals blog. It basically highlights great work by women that might perhaps otherwise go unrecognized. But she also likes to spoof the sort of brat pack articles that talk about, like packs of dudes doing awesome stuff, like the young politicos rising in Washington, or the duditors. Seriously, the group of 40-something powerful editors who like to hang out and go for drinks and happen to be white and male. Like, color me shocked, wow, it's 2011. So that's the sort of thing that, she does an excellent job of skewering. She skewers the ridiculous of it because she points out that while these mainstream publications like the New York Times and the Washington Post are focusing on pockets of men, there are women who are similarly situated in those same pockets, albeit of women, who are not being so recognized. So the blind spot also rears its head in terms of what you consume. This is the AP story about the top 10 tweets of Academy Awards night. Now, I don't know about you, or if you happen to follow me on Twitter, you probably know, but I really like to watch TV with my Twitter nearby. And I will live tweet, and I will watch all the tweets, and I will retweet, and I definitely did that during the Oscars. And I definitely cracked up at some really funny stuff by women. And yet, every single one of these tweets, except for the unattributed one from The Onion, were by dudes. Now, I'm not saying that Michael Ian Black is not a funny guy, but I do think that we can do better than, please, Natalie Portman, have your baby on stage. Like, there are levels of wit that we can aspire to, and I know for a fact, and I even go so far to say that I may have even reached a level of wit higher than that. I don't want to be pushy, but it is entirely possible. So this has to do with, I don't mean to single out Jake Coyle, who happened to wrote this, but I guess I am. But then again, this article went all across the world wherever the AP goes. But maybe he should follow more women, and he'll be able to see that there were other things happening on Academy Awards night, other tweets, and maybe, just maybe, have a funnier and better top 10 list. I'm not even sure I need to really say anything here. This is the panel assembled for Elliot Spitzer's panel on Anthony Weiner on CNN. I'll just let Nancy Franklin say it best. Spitzer's powerhouse political panel on Weiner, James Carville, Rick Lazio, and Howard Kurtz. In other news, Earth now an all-male planet. And we go on. This is an illustration from an article in New York Magazine on the New York tech scene in April 2010. And when I say that this article was significant, I mean this is the article that basically launched Change the Ratio. It was an article in the New York tech scene. It focused primarily on guys. It quoted primarily guys, except for there was a quote from Katarina Fake from Flickr and then Hunch, and now her new startup, and another quote from Elizabeth Stark, who spoke specifically about where the women were. And then there was like a laundry list of women in the tech scene, but that laundry list of women actually wasn't interviewed or quoted in the piece, and only a few of them were photographed. So there was a photo set, and it included 53 guys and 6 women, but actually 5.5 women. That is Teresa Wall. I've never met her, but I know her because of this, from meetup.com, and that is Scott Heiferman's foot in her face. He's the founder. And it's not their fault. They were just posing in a boys will be boys, roughhousing pose. But the fact that an editor at New York Magazine didn't see that and see that there was a problem with it is really, there's something wrong with that. And what's wrong with that is the blind spot. And that's, you know, it's sort of like the day-to-day sins of omission, the I didn't realize, it's wow, I have this conference and 95% of the speakers are white men and I totally didn't realize it. And that happens often, and I think it's important to note that this is a sin of omission, and it's not something that people conspire. There's no backroom conspiracies like how can we exclude marginalized constituencies, but it just ends up happening. More recently, Fortune came out with its 40 under 40 list earlier this month, and there were only 6 women on the list, but the grindstone pointed out that actually some of the honorees were pairs of people. So it ended up being Fortune's 46 under 40, and there were still 6 women. So it was actually 40 men under 40 and 6 women. And so they worked that out to 13% women, but if you'll notice, on the cover, there were 2 women and 1 man. So this was a subjective list. It wasn't about net worth or anything like that. And Ruth Graham made the point, I'm just going to read this, is it seems to me like Fortune is saying that women make up 13% of people worth reading about and 66% of women worth looking at. And now for your moment of Zen. So all the women in the room can just take a moment to process and then move on from any latent PTSD feelings this may evoke. I know that as a woman covering the 2008 election, it was maybe a little bit frustrating, particularly when there were so many different examples of sexism and it wasn't actually recognized as an issue by the mainstream, I'm putting in quotes here, until around April. And so that meant from, like, let's say at least January to April, there were a lot of us like literally bonking our heads against the wall saying, I don't understand how this keeps happening. But I'm going to focus on one element here. This is a woman that I interviewed at Hillary Clinton's concession speech. She was one of the so-called Pumas. I think it's People United to Make a Difference, or I should know what that is, but I don't. But the Pumas were basically a loose coalition of older women. And it was a previously unrecognized, invisible, uninfluential constituency. And I remember when the sort of sudden flash of anger at Hillary being pushed out of the race in sort of like March, April, May of 2008 flared up, and they started organizing and like being really angry at rallies. The pundit, bewilderment, like, I can't believe that these women are actually influential. And it was because this was a totally invisibilized group of people in society. And so ageism is another blind spot that is very prevalent. And so this woman was disconsolate at Hillary leaving the race, not only because she really supported Hillary, but she felt that she was losing the only candidate who actually saw her and gave a damn about her. It's really very moving and powerful. and I hope she's okay now. So the blind spot is mostly blind, but sometimes it's willfully blind. Seemingly, really? This is about the dude who stood up at a Hillary Clinton rally in New Hampshire, January 2008, with a sign that said, "Iron my shirt." Okay, that is not seemingly sexist. That is just sexist. And the fact that USA Today thought that seemingly fit in this headline is ludicrous. So again, I return to the PTSD and the bonking my head against the wall, because this is literally the stuff that went on all day, every day. But I'm going to step away from the gender issues right now, just to prove that I can, and talk about just more generally about marginalized constituencies and looking around. So I attended a great event in June, organized by a number of people, including Matt Thompson, who's going to be presenting later, called Spark Camp. And a woman named Latoya Peterson gave this amazing presentation where she talked about being like a culture writer and being asked to write about Nirvana and Kurt Cobain and their impact on the culture, and sort of reflecting that she doesn't usually get to ask about those things, and wondering, do the people who tend to write those narratives tend to define them? And if people like her are not writing those narratives, if they're writing their own narratives, then do those narrative streams ever cross? And do we only see one side of the story? And she really blew my mind. And so what she said, when we leave people out, when we start erasing voices that don't fit the narrative that we think they should fit, we start missing those larger pieces of the puzzle. And so back to what I was saying before about not seeing things. So when I was at Media8, I greenlit, we were doing a whole end of the decade thing, and I greenlit a piece that one of my writers, sent it in to me. It was a slideshow of 28 media leaders that we had lost in the past decade. And I looked it through, it looked good. I said, go team, and we published it. And then, am I allowed to swear on this? And then the bleep storm began, because there wasn't a single person of color on that list. Now that's a decade. It's safe to say that if there is a merit, bar that has to be reached, that in a decade, any constituency can have at least one person. You just have to not even look. You just have to care to see it. And so we took in the criticism and acknowledged it and said that, yeah, we screwed up, and I certainly won't do that again. So I think it's, the important point to take from that is not just that, frankly, I can be a douchebag too, but this is an amazing example of why we need diversity in newsrooms. Even the most well-intentioned person can't see everything or see from a perspective they don't have. Chimamanda Adichie, I hope I said that right, talks about the danger of a single story. She gave a TED talk about growing up in Nigeria and reading English books, and then when she started to write, she would write tales of blonde, blue-eyed children who played in the snow. She did not know that type of person, and she did not play in that type of environment at all. She was in Nigeria. Later, she talked about going away to school, meeting her roommate, and her roommate, doing the whole so what language do you speak? And thinking she didn't know how to use simple appliances. And talked about how all of that comes from being exposed to just one narrative, just one story. And that goes back to what Latoya Peterson was saying about, the blind spot exists anywhere that we are not looking, when we're only looking in a certain way, when we're only facing down a certain track. I would be remiss if I did not talk about women in comedy as well, because 2011 has been a very important year for recognizing that women can be funny and are not just the adorable sidekick or the klutzy girl who somehow figures it out and lands the guy. And both of those things go back actually to Minnie Kaling. She wrote something really great in the New Yorker about that recently. But it is, you don't see that happen with men. You just don't see there being only one person who can inherit it. Unless, of course, it's someone like Steve Jobs, and then everybody who could possibly be the next Steve Jobs is a guy. But we'll get to that later. I just want to basically lay it out there, because I think it's really important that we remember that. Women are not a niche. They are half the population, and that, and they are just, thank you. And that, and you can insert, blank is not a niche, for a whole bunch of different constituencies that are continually ignored. Here's one. Hippies. Not a niche, it turns out. A lot of people bet wrong on that one, didn't they? And I will say that there are like practical benefits that go to recognizing this early on, because when I Googled media missing Occupy Wall Street, although I did choose The Atlantic for their funny headline, it was just New York Observer, New York Observer, New York Observer coming up. They were down there early, and they reaped the SEO benefits. All right, now back to Steve Jobs. There's been a lot of attention, obviously, paid to Steve Jobs, and I have definitely been part of writing about, consuming, interested. I bought the book. I can quote the commercial. Help me out here. Come on, you all know it. Okay, you ruined my little, I expected someone to shout out, here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the round pegs and square holes. Anyhow, what I was going to say, you all know that because it's been played nonstop, but I still stand by that point. I just think you're shy. The point being that, that we all basically stopped and really focused on this one very important story for the last few weeks. And so you wonder, when you're looking at, when everybody suddenly turns and swivels to look at one thing and, and gets off, it's not just the technology people. The technology people have been following Steve Jobs this whole time. They knew who Jonathan Ive was before this week. But you have the people on their beats, and then you have the people who do the swivel. And those people are the swing voters of media. So the swing voters are basically the hobbyists or the generalists, people who are not on a specific beat and who turn their attention to whatever the story of the day is, like the classic example, like Joe Klein, Maureen Dowd, Frank Rich, people who, the columnists, the people who, the bloggers, the tweeters. I mean, we see this more and more now that media is more real time, but it's always been that there are the people who cover their various beats, and then there's the people who stand in the middle and point to the things that are important for everybody. And so those people are swing voters. And so I'm going to take you back now to an actual case study before Twitter was that prevalent. But, I forgot my punchline, which was, they follow the shiny object. Well, you get it. All right, now I'm going to go to my case study from before Twitter was really prevalent and before sort of the real-time situation we have today. I want to focus on 1 week in 2008 when Barack Obama gave his speech on race. Within a week, it had 3.8 million views, and it had 500,000 views through other sources. Everybody tuned in on cable. It was the top story on the New York Times most emailed list. The race speech dominated the media coverage. It was simply the week of the speech. I had to put that in orange because I missed the Huffington Post, where I covered this whole story. So what did we miss in that week? What happened on March 17th? What happened on the 18th? What happened on the 19th? Well, what happened on the 16th and 17th was Bear Stearns died, and JP Morgan bailed it out. Greenspan said it was the worst depression that had happened since World War II, and little did he know, I guess. And Gretchen Morgenson, prophetically as it turns out, said, what are the consequences of a world in which regulators rescue even the financial institutions whose recklessness and greed helped create the titanic credit mess we are in? This is March 16th, 2008. All right, fast forward a few months. But for now, just let that sink in, March 16th, 2008. On March 19th, it was the 5th anniversary of the Iraq War, which had had dwindling coverage anyway, but still. March 18th had been the speech. March 19th was the Iraq War anniversary, and really no one was talking about it. In the last year, a flagging economy and the most competitive presidential campaign in memory have diverted attention and resources. So that's what happened in that week. And these are the numbers. 39% of the news was on the campaign, 72% of that was about Obama, which meant that basically 28% of the news that week was about Obama. The next was the economy. So Greenspan says that it's the worst financial crisis since World War II. Gretchen Morgenson notes that things could get really, really bad, and it gets 16%. So the swing voters weren't looking at the economy. The Iraq War got 10%. And I don't know if you remember protests in Tibet. They were significant because the Beijing Olympics were happening in 2008. I mean, they were significant anyway, but even so, 5%. So what would have happened if the race speech had happened in another week? Would we have drawn a line from the fall of Bear Stearns to 5 years in Iraq and the loss of blood and treasure, would people have stopped to think that, hey, the country's in crisis? Would there have been more scrutiny on the banks? Would there have been more scrutiny on the financial institutions? Would there have been more scrutiny in general? What would happen if we started looking someplace else? Latoya says that it points out that people often consider diversity and including diversity as work, but on the other hand, it's actually freeing. It allows you to see things other people aren't seeing and go places that other people aren't going and uncover the stories that could just turn out to be important come September 2008. There isn't just a single story, so the moral here is to remember to look in your blind spot. Thank you.